Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing? So I've got another enlightening and wonderful person here to chat with today. But before we start that, let's start with a disclaimer and the reminder that this is not a substitute for mental health therapy. This is for entertainment and educational purposes. So I'm going to encourage you to find a therapist in your area to work on your unique issues and to help you find the path that is your path, not just the blanket manualized one. So today, in that aspect of interesting stories, I have presented twice with who I'm chatting with today, and as an associate of ours walked up to us after watching us prep for one of the presentations, it said to me, it's like, "Oh, so you're work spouses." And you can hear them laughing in the background here. So it's like, yeah, we just sort of started getting known as each other's work spouse in that particular setting. Not that we actually work in the same places, but just that aspect of, oh, that's the work wife and I'm the work husband. It's like, okay. So who I'm talking about is Crystal Blanton. I'm tongue-tying myself right now, who is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience in the field. She's also an activist, writer, restorative justice facilitator, trainer, mother, and wife here in the Bay Area. Crystal currently works as a program manager for a nonprofit organization working with children and family, works on managing equity teams, and runs a small private practice as well. So she's been definitely being that superwoman, multitasking all of these things. Crystal is very passionate about the integration and intersectionality and cultural elements into her work, including the acknowledgement of environment, social elements, and the impact and individual's experience of the world. She's active in the macro level social work advocacy and activism to support equality, accessibility, and increasing community resources. So Crystal, welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, the classic question to start with is, how did you find yourself working in this field?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, my mom was really my gateway into this work. My mom was not a degreed social worker. But, that is exactly what she did in the world, was social work. And so, she ran a daycare. There was multiple people that lived in my house as I was growing up. And I just got used to what it meant to be present for other people by watching my mom. So then it kind of felt natural to transition into that kind of work as I got older and working in group homes and working in the segment of the work where working with people who had physical disabilities and other types of mental disabilities, and then landed into drug treatment, where I decided to go back to school and get the rest of those letters. And so that's kind of how I got into the work. But I think the first reflection was my mom.
Which was actually interesting. I did an interview just before that, so it had a similar story, but it's not one that is as common amongst everybody that I've had a chance to interview, of how the generational influence for this work has come to be. For many of us, it's like, we've gone through a myriad of other jobs and other experiences before we find ourselves here working in mental health. Right.
Absolutely. And I think, my mom was an amazing woman and from the South, and moved to California. And I think that there is just so much in our culture I want to say, in my culture, as a Black woman, of, you know, how we are or have been socialized through, you know, all of our experiences and historical traumas, to be the caregivers, to show up and be the supporters. And I think that was one of the things that my mom learned from her mom and from her grandma and showed me. And it just somehow I then ended up as a social worker. So there you go.
Yeah. That one thing led to another one.
Yeah.
And with the work you do, as with this, everything that's happened with this pandemic has shown the need for more BIPOC therapists is greatly needed. And I'm curious, how does that also interrelate with the activism work you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are two sides of the same coin in many ways. I feel like, first of all, I guess I would say that, you know, I'm really, one of the things that calls me to the world of social work is the fact that, you know, social justice and activism or advocacy is a huge part of our work. And so that feels very natural to me to merge some of that. And then I also think as a Black woman working with other people of color, there's, you know, our existence is political. It is, you know, the idea of advocacy and getting our needs met through those many different channels is a you know, a way of life, and for the most part. And so I think that it pairs very well when we get away from some of the traditional ways that psychology and other, you know, formats of training, you know, stick us into certain boxes, right? When we're able to look at the whole person and what the whole picture of what it means to be a BIPOC person in the world and in the therapy world, I think it pairs very well.
And this actually gets into another area too, where we can tick off an additional box, which actually has to do with the presentations you and I were both giving, which also deals in the areas of our spirituality when we are not, for lack of better example, fitting the big two. When I speak of the big two, I'm talking about Christianity or Islam.
Right.
So for us, and I'm coming out here on this standpoint, is I am not a member of either of those two. I do not identify with either of those two. I have more of an identification with working with ancestors. And as a result, that means looking more at some of the more earth-based religions. I'm looking at more of the, shall we say, African traditional religions as well, which is a segment of what also exists in this world, and the question of how that interacts too with mental health is an area that don't see much written about, don't hear much talked about. And this is an opportunity for us to let's talk about how that intersection works, being people of color who are also not practicing some of the mainstream religions.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the powerful things I have witnessed or been able to be a part of with the people that I work with is that kind of exploration of not only their cultural side, but how their different spiritual pieces come together, and how that connects to some of their culture and their ancestral lineage, and also then their stories and what they know of their family, their trauma histories, historical trauma, right? Like it's like this big, you know, old supervisor used to call it a pot of gumbo, right? And so it is like this big pot of gumbo that we get to explore and be a part of. And I think, you know, the spiritual mind, the spiritual body, that part of all of us is relevant in any healing work that we do. So it's really powerful to explore some of that in the work that I get to do, that I'm privileged enough to do with other people. And I think my own, I guess I'll say my own practices and my own connection to kind of what some might consider an alternative spiritual path, right? Because it isn't one of the two, the big two, allows me a lot of understanding and flexibility to navigate with people outside of this rigid or potentially rigid box where spirituality and religion is, kind of sits in sometimes. So I rely on that part of myself a lot, right? Like we can, take a corner here and talk about it in this way. We can talk about it in that way. We can talk about crystals. Let's do some mindfulness. We can speak about, the power of ancestral music and how that supports one with, being present or grounded or connected to their lineage or their roots, or somebody in their family that feels like their biggest supporter, or did feel like their biggest supporter, and exploring that through different avenues. And that feels very natural to me because of some of my spiritual stuff, where for other people it may not. So I think it's amazing, right? And we can talk about it outside of the box of religion and just connect to the spirituality of a person, and how those threads go way beyond anything that has a religious title on it.
And just to be fair, usually I refer to the big two. There's usually the big three when we throw Judaism in there as well.
Sure.
As being the big predominance that most happen in the world and most get talked about in the idea of, if we're bringing in spirituality, not even, and I'm not even denying like Buddhism or anything like that, but it's just this sense of, oh no, when we talk about religion, is usually one of these big three. And to be frank, if that is your jam, there are plenty of other podcasts out there to go and listen to. And I have no problem if you guys want to go listen to that and stop listening here. This is for the rest of us. So.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And I think that also brings into, as you said, this aspect of the person is much more the whole macrocosms, which includes this spirituality, which includes this both ancestral trauma, historical trauma, but also this ancestral healing and this historical healing as well.
Absolutely. And I think the one of the beautiful things about it that I've discovered is it doesn't stop me from connecting or working with the very same things, or in the same areas with people who are of the other bigger religions, because we can connect from a place of spirituality and connection to ancestral kind of threads, right? Regardless. And that is a really powerful thing. And I think, for some people, that's it gives them permission to explore in a way that they haven't otherwise, right? And so,
or equally to feel like there is a place that they can also seek the mental health in, because one of the biggest things that comes up is the idea of what's called magical thinking. Now, for those of you who are wondering what's magical thinking, depending on who is, again, describing the context of this, magical thinking is the idea that something is magically going to happen just because we think it is. And that is a way that acknowledging, say, the spirits of a river or wanting to enjoy communing with nature, there are ways that there have been practices over the, let's call it centuries, that have demonized that or indicated that someone is mentally unwell because they would rather protect the sanctity of a water source, which they draw life from, than pollute it. And that's a big one, especially when we start talking about the cultural beliefs of people who are BIPOC and not purely part of the big three, or shall we say Western life.
Right. And I think that, so many people who are seeking therapy support, who are, I think in general, but especially for those of us who are BIPOC, we are carrying different parts of ourselves that we are reconciling in this work. And our spiritual self is just as present as, some of the other parts of us that we are trying to work with or lead to a different place, including those parts of us that have been wounded or traumatized. So I think it's really important that, when we're talking about, safety, which, that word is relative, but, a sense of safety that we're creating in this work, that we are allowing space for all the pieces to show up. And that includes culture, and that includes the spiritual self, and that includes our ancestral connections, whatever those are for someone, or even the idea of exploring that. And that includes the advocacy parts and the parts of us that have to fight every day, or that have to deal with the socio-political stuff that's happening because of our race or culture. It's all of those things, and then finding ways to, in the safety, the relative safety of our work, to allow all of those parts to be seen and worked with and reconcile with one another. So, I think it's so important that we're moving past the place of just magical thinking, which so many of us are conditioned to think, like, if you just pray about it, or if you just do these things, that, it'll work itself out. And sometimes it does, but, we also know, especially those of us in these intersecting communities, that, there is a level of active work to manifest the kind of wellness that we want in our lives. And that doesn't usually just fall in our laps. And so if we can bring all of ourselves to a space, then maybe we can make some inroads in moving forward.
Very much so. Because, that aspect of pray it away, which is often what we hear in Islam, that can also appear in the non-alternate thinking methods too, and sometimes sadly also be cultivated because somebody's not actually looking at their wounds. They can find the stories and connection with the various other spiritual deities, other sense of nature that can match their wound, and then they stop. Right. As opposed to also recognizing, it's like, okay, how did this spirit then go beyond its wound?
How do we connect to and identify the pieces that wound us, and then also the pieces that help us to thrive, and the pieces that empower us to move past one experience or moment in our life, or whatever the case may be, so that we can get to a place of relative wellness, healing, whatever word we want to put on it, balance, all those things. And yes, I think all spiritual stories and connections can give us some idea of, at least in that, kind of snapshot, how that particular deity or that particular spirit or ancestral kind of story got from a place of woundedness to, the next stage, whatever that is. If we are looking for that. And I think sometimes in our woundedness, we get, I don't want to say stuck as in it's a bad thing, because it's not, but I think we get kind of stuck in the pain of it. And sometimes it's hard to move to that other place, right? Which is why we're here.
Exactly. So then there also becomes our struggle too of normalizing in this venue that mental health, seeking a therapist, is actually normal. And frankly, there's a lot of those spirits that says, no, I'm not the one who needs to address this. The therapist does.
Absolutely.
That we are, in many ways, tools of those spirits as well.
Yes. Absolutely. In the same way that I think that, so many healers, as a use of that term, are is just extensions of, their connection to spirit, in the work that they do. And I think, we as therapists and, we have the ability to be an extension of change and connection to spirit, and also bring some additional tools in that process. And that's a really powerful combination.
Which doesn't usually get well showcased. But then again, that's also one of the difficulties we have in some ways with therapy, because it's not something that is on display for everyone to see, because of how vulnerable the parts that some cases have to be addressed. And that sense of safety can't be voyeurized.
Correct. Yeah, for sure. And I think that, in addition to that, there's also this piece that it's hard for us to ignore when we are BIPOC therapists, of course, that, therapy itself is pretty colonized, and, for lack of a better term. And so, the way that it, not only do people not get to watch it, as you're saying, or get to see what a therapeutic process looks like, for all the reasons, but also there is this kind of reputation and history that therapy work has, that we are actively undoing as BIPOC therapists, so that people of all different types can feel safe in seeking this type of support.
And that doesn't mean that every BIPOC therapist is the right therapist for you to work with.
Not at all.
Equally, not every issue that that somebody thinks that they're coming to work with is actually the issue that needs to be worked on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Which is often a surprise to everybody. But yes, absolutely.
And just consider how many different stories are out there about, say, a trickster deity taking on a different appearance and then suddenly revealing who they actually are underneath it.
I have some similar stories about that for myself too.
Exactly.
So yes.
And then in that way, that relation to it is also not magical thinking, but it is a way of finding that connection to this situation.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think a part of that connection also, is building relationship with these different parts of ourselves and different deities or different stories, whatever that means for us, so that we can internalize it and move to action instead of just being stuck in that kind of magical thinking, or, being stuck in the inability to move forward.
Very much so. And I think too, on other aspects is there is, and then the sense of the over-identifying with the wound or the deity who's like, oh, they always had this place and they never, again, moved beyond it. And I think about the example of, as is often said, many of us who work in this field are wounded. We're wounded healers. And the standpoint of, and this classic story that goes with the story of Chiron, who is the epitome of that archetype. Yeah, wounded, went around the world, learning to heal themselves, couldn't heal the wound that they had, but that knowledge was something they could pass on to help others heal.
Right.
And just imagining somebody who just stopped at that aspect of Chiron is wounded, he's seeking some help, but never actually gets it healed. Which is actually an interesting metaphor for the entire story of Doctor Strange in the MCU. Sorry.
Yeah.
Interesting sideway, it just popped in my head.
I really like that, point that you're making. I really like that point. It reminds me of, I guess I would say, the humility that is required in this work, that we are not really any different than anybody that we're working with. We're all in this process of learning about what it is that we need and how to take care of ourselves and how to be present in the world around us. And the being humble and understanding that, yeah, I have my own wounds too. And we've seen a lot of people in this work that struggle with holding that about themselves, and like they have the best answer, they have the whatever, right? And even in the story that you were just sharing, of thinking about, like, that applies to all of us in some ways. And the lessons that I can bring forward based in my own story or my own wounded parts, right? That is a piece of the work that I can do with a person, right? Because it's some of the work that I've been able to experience as well. And at some point, that person that I'm working with may not need to work with someone else, because like my work is, that's what I mean by that humility. Like, like it goes to a certain point. And then, there are other people who have more or different aspects of the work that they can give. It reminds me, I was just watching, what's the show on Apple TV? Oh, The Shrink Next Door. Ah. And I was watching that and thinking about, working, this guy worked with, based on true story, he worked with the psychologist for 30 years. And I'm like, yeah, no.
Yeah.
No, because at a certain point, right, like I've given or taught or supported all that I can with the tools that I have. Right, based on all my own intersecting pieces, including my own wounds, right? And there's a place of humility for us as providers to remember that, so that people can continue to grow beyond one particular person.
Exactly, one particular perspective, one particular ideal, which as you talk about that, it's like there's certain thoughts I know in the spiritual house I'm part of, where you will, while you may be identified as this particular deity's particular child, you get farmed out to other ones to do work as well. And there is also that notion that, well, why do I need to be farmed out to these others when this is the deity that I'm connected with? It's like, no, these other deities have power over other places, other things, and other ways of being for you to learn, which you don't hear in, let's call it, the big two.
That's right. And I
or big three, sorry.
Yeah. And I think that is such an amazing practice and way to, look at and internalize some of these things we're talking about. I think that's fabulous, right? We get to learn and connect and build relationship in many different ways, and not just one. There isn't one magical answer.
Which also traces back to that classic saying, it takes a village.
Yes.
That the idea of a pantheon is its own village that's taking care of the mental health of the person.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure, and I don't know that I'm the best person to do this, but I'm sure there is such a amazing thread there around the differences in the way that colonization has impacted the way that we see those concepts, and the true authority kind of perspective versus the village, right? And how that trickles into spiritual practices and the meta message that we are socialized with, here in the Western world, at least, around, you're seeking the one answer or the one person or the one God or the one right path, versus, this more collective community, village sense, which is, much different
Mm-hmm.
than how we are socialized here in the States.
Mm-hmm. Which is its own form of decolonizing.
That's right. Yes.
So I think that's an excellent spot for us to take a break. So stick around, folks, and come in for part 2 of my talk with Crystal Blanton here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark. Talk to you soon.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information. You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Crystal Blanton, licensed social worker, clinical social worker. And one of the things that, as we've been talking, have been very much about spirituality and what come in its intersection with mental health. One of the big things that also came up is how have those of us in the alternative spirituality and so forth been looking at the situation we've been in for now going on year 3 of the pandemic. And how does that both align with much of the greater social thoughts, and how does it differ? So what's been your experience and encounter in this?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's been really interesting to watch different alternative spiritual communities, for lack of a better term, kind of reposition during the pandemic, and try to figure out ways to have community and have connection with such huge isolation and barriers around doing that. It's been really interesting to watch that. And I think, of course, like in every other aspect of life, the internet has helped so much, right? Yay, Zoom. But, but I think it's, a real struggle. And I think it's really interesting as, there are these periods in the pandemic where we are doing better with our numbers, right? Or we're not in a surge, and there's this push for people to be able to be in person, and kind of watching how communities are navigating that. I find that very interesting. And they're, how people are navigating the vaccine thing, how people are navigating, what it means to be safe, what things need to be outside. How do we have connection in a physical way, so that we can have that spiritual connection that we're used to having in, presence with other people, but also be safe. And what does that even mean right now? So it's really interesting to watch communities grapple with that.
As well as that aspect of so much depending on the trigger community, the only way to have a ritual or that communion with spirit is in a large group.
Right.
And it's like I said, yay, Zoom. It's a very different experience of what does it mean to be in that community, to connect with this deity or this energy or this sense of nature via that.
Right.
And that can also be what helps generate the issues that now need somebody to come into therapy.
Absolutely. Because I think there's been a whole different world that people have been navigating, and, how that impacts the spiritual for them, and not being able to get that connection, feeling, support, whatever the case may be, that they're used to having in that way, which is one of their kind of supports, their tools in managing life for them, is then impacted, right? Then I could see in very many ways how it has pushed people to seek support in therapy. Their resources have been diminished by the pandemic.
Even though fundamentally disease moments have happened throughout history and throughout spiritual experiences, it's common, just not on the scale we've been dealing with it. Yeah.
And definitely, I think for us living today, this has been an experience like not necessarily like ones that we're used to or that we've experienced before, especially over here, in the States. And so I think it definitely rocked people and is rocking people in a way that we didn't have the tools or resources to manage personally.
Some might say this is where the colonizing idea has hurt has hurt us all, especially the colonizer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting when we get a chance to sit and unpack that and thinking about that from the spiritual community perspective. Like that thread of individualism that is such a part of the colonized viewpoint versus this sense of what it means to be a part of community and have community connection and responsibility and accountability. And all of that really came up in this pandemic, in every aspect of our lives, but even in the spiritual, community world. How do we what do we prioritize? Right? What we individually need, I say this in no disrespect to any spiritual community, but we can be spiritual at home by ourselves too. We can connect with our deities. We can do the work that we need to do, but there's something about being with others and how we do that. But then how do we reconcile individuality and community responsibility in that process? I don't know that we've ever really been in the spot to make those decisions like this.
Equally, have we ever been in the spot where we've had to even begin to recognize where there's that moment between them? Because again, it's very easily becomes that either one or the other. It's like, it's not either one or the other. It's both and yet both sides, and I hate to put it in this way, both sides, also has its points where it has its shadows. There's a shadow to collectivism. There's a shadow to individualism, and we can't keep ignoring them anymore.
That's right. There's always a price when we ignore those shadows, and even that more so right now when we are navigating different levels of safety on the physical realm, right? Like, the harm happens, in other ways too, but I think it's more in your face when people are like, okay, so I could catch this and I could like not make it, right? That's a whole nother level of, you can't ignore the shadow sides that come with, some of these pieces.
Which becomes shadow work as a very intense component of spiritual growth and spiritual healing as well, which in many ways can also get lost in the idea of magical thinking.
Absolutely. And that, people who I'll say that a lot of times in, alternative kind of spiritual communities, the idea of doing shadow work and the importance of shadow work is more accessible to speak about than in some other spiritual communities. But there, I know there's also a lot of fear around what it means to do that shadow work. It's uncomfortable, it's scary, all of the things, and I personally feel that way, right? And have for a long time. the nervousness around, navigating that shadow work. And I think that's one of the things that the pandemic has really done, is that, like, it's never really a choice, but it's definitely not a choice now. Right? Like, you're in it, whether, you like it or not, and you're going to have to, learn what you need to learn from it, and navigate it. It's, I think that's really challenging. And it took us a really long, shadow work lesson, I just want to say. Right? Like, going into year 3, right? We're like, oh my gosh, right? Exactly. It's a lot of work.
Exactly. And that realization isn't something that, again, is going to be there for most people. But when we look at these other contexts, these other stories, these alternate places, which is, I'm not saying alternate facts, but alternate, the good way, it does start making the sense of what we're going through.
Yeah. And I, there are people I would rely on that do ancestral work in different ways than I do, that are quite amazing, that would be great to answer these kinds of questions. But it really does make me wonder, what is the larger macro ancestral message that we are learning right now, that we probably don't want to learn as a society around, some of these pieces, what it means to be present and making these decisions, and kind of the interconnected responsibilities we have for one another, and the individual responsibilities that we have for ourselves in order to heal, do the work, whatever the case may be. I feel like there's, going into year 3, it really, there's a clear, for me, spiritual message that's being handed down by the ancestors, that are like, all right, now we're going to learn it. You're going to learn it now.
Right. Very much so. And I put it this way, Luna, I'm looking at you. We need to get things scheduled.
I said everything I could to not say Luna's name, but that is exactly who was in my mind, of somebody that I respect around a macro ancestral message. So absolutely, Luna. Shout out to Luna.
Yeah, so as soon as I can get her on, you guys will be able to hear about it. With all of that, and this proved to be a very enlightening conversation that I hadn't expected, this also brings into other areas of not just the pandemic, what we've also dealt with as dealing with racism in the pagan and alternate spirituality communities too. And I think you've written a number of articles and books on this too.
That's what I've heard. Yeah, for sure. It's been, I don't know how, well, I do kind of know how, but it wasn't my original plan to start writing about some of those things in the community. I kind of got gifted with that, and it came first via, a publisher who brought the idea forward. And then from there, I think, the ancestors in many ways were like, oh yeah, about that. How about that? Right. And so, I feel very blessed to have been able to put some of my thoughts down. And that's where a lot of, too, I'll just say, like, for me, a lot of my spiritual and activism and social work world started to merge, right? Even before I really recognized that that's what was happening, started to merge, where I was writing about, from the perspective of, a spiritual person, a pagan, an alternative religious person, and really highlighting some of the experiences and needs of BIPOC people inside of a community that is largely Eurocentric in its values and the way that it embraces people, and Yeah, it's been a blessing to write about some of that. So yes, absolutely. I wrote in the book, Bringing Race to the Table, Exploring Racism in the Pagan Community. And, that's actually an anthology. So many people wrote in it. I was blessed with 2 others to be able to edit it, to be the editor. So I have some pieces in it, and there's some other brilliant pieces in there written by many very talented people. Just to talk about not only the stories that people have, but also some of the, how they connect in mythology in some areas, and activism, just the whole kind of larger picture inside of a pagan community context. And so,
So definitely we'll have the listing of that book in the show notes as well, so that you can, if you're interested, you can take a look at that. So at this point, I think it's about time we move on to my classic question of, what do you think are some of the myths and realities of therapy, not just for someone who is BIPOC, but also someone who is alternate spirituality?
Right. I think some of the myths are that they will come into therapy and we will tell them the right way to be. And then the reality, of course, is we don't know the right way to be. We're just, we are supporting people with the tools so that they can uncover whatever it is that they need to make decisions about in their life and how they navigate. But there is no right way.
And now that, with that standpoint, it makes me wonder if, again, that's the byproduct of the colonizing, whether it's the aspect of the power plays that some might see, depending on spirituality being malused by those who desire power.
Absolutely.
I hate to say it, I can't help but think about the movie Lady Hawk. As just one of those many examples we see, not just in media, but again, throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you want me to come up with another myth?
If you got another one, we got a little time still.
I think one of the myths is that we are the experts. Yes, that we're the experts, and also that it's like, I guess the only words that come to mind is that you don't have a genuine relationship with the therapist that you're working with. And I think the reality of that is that it is a genuine relationship, while it's not a regular social relationship, and it has different kinds of boundaries, that we are in an active, real relationship, where we are having shared goals for a person and working towards that. And that requires a sense of, building a relationship and being, like relative safety with one another, and what that means, and to be able to be our authentic selves. And that's a little different on the therapist side, but I think it is still so very important that when, people come into the work with us or session, they know that their therapist is a real person. And that they're not putting on a front. And, like I have some of the people I work with, they're like, oh yeah, I already knew what you would say. And I'm like, sweet, that saves me some time, right? Because we have an authentic, real connection and relationship. Even if it is a working relationship, it's not fake.
Which is, again, part of what would happen and I remember I wrote this in my paper to get into my grad program. It's like priests, shamans, they were the original therapists before we even had the field and discipline of psychology.
Yes. The medicine people in our villages and communities, absolutely 100%. And they, we knew what their skills and strengths were, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how they could support. And we also connected to the fact that they were a part of our village.
Mm-hmm.
They were, real people. We knew where they were. We knew how to get to them, and, and they cared, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I really like that connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't like the more, the way that Western society kind of paints us to be like a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
or like the all-knowing, not to say that some therapists aren't doctors,
Right.
but whatever, where I'm going.
Yeah.
Where we sit there with the pad of paper,
The authority.
and that's right. And you come in and you tell us what's wrong, and we tell you how to do it differently. And then, let us know what you need, kind of thing, versus we are in community together. And we are a part of a larger village. And what does it mean to work together in that way, in a collaborative sense, a connected sense, where I'm not going to have all the answers, but together we can really identify some ways to move forward. And that's a powerful thought.
Very much so. Yeah. Okay, you need to go spend some time over there working with the forge guy. Nope. Now you need to go spend some time working with the hunter out in the woods. Now you need to go over here and work on the person who's dyeing the fabrics. Every single one of them has got something they'll be able to teach you in perspective. That's
right. And all of them are a part of our intersecting communities, right? So we get to learn here. Right. And then integrate those pieces that work for us. Yeah.
So I think that's the best place we can go with what we've got time for.
Yeah.
So where can folks find you, find your writings and your books, anything you might be appearing at?
Yeah. Well, so I have my website, Blanton, LCSW.com, BLANTON, LCSW.com. And I'm on Instagram. I have my social work account that I post all things kind of mental health, social work related, advocacy, activism stuff. And that is exploring wellness and liberation. And so that's on Instagram. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, I then joined TikTok. And so that's wellness and liberation on TikTok. And so then you can see silly videos of me. I mean, I'm not dancing in my videos. I'm talking about mental health stuff, but I try to make them fun. And for books, I mean, your local shops, hopefully like your local metaphysical shops or whatnot, may have Bringing Race to the Table. It is available online through all the regular channels, and also through Emanian Press. And I do want to plug, can I plug something really quick?
Sure.
Yeah. So I am in conversation right now with NASW, which is the National Association of Social Workers, the California chapter, to be on a panel around macro social work. And the title of the kind of conference is Macro Social Work, Translating Social Justice into Action. And so that's going to be Friday, May 13th. And they both say Friday. Oh, they are. They're both Friday. Friday, May 13th and Friday, May 20th. So 2 Fridays in a row on Zoom, where the NASW is going to have some amazing panels and conversations around, macro social work, policy work, advocacy on the larger scale kind of work, and holding a core of social justice in all of that. And so I encourage people who are interested to look that up through NASW California. And if there's any questions that people want to ask, they have email for event reg, so EVENTREG at naswca.org.
All right. I will try to get this up before that event happens if I can. But since it's 2 Fridays, if you can't make the first Friday, make the second one.
Yes, and I think, you know, in the conversations, I might be on a panel on the second Fridays.
Okay.
So that's what it's looking like.
All righty. Well, Crystal, I want to thank you again for coming on, and hey, maybe we need to have a part 2 as things go on, as we see. And
that would be fun.
Definitely. And I hope you enjoy your rest of your week and holiday, because just for FYI for folks, we're recording this in January. Today happens to be the 17th, Martin Luther King Day.
Yes.
So again, be safe out there. Remember, Spirit is with you, and so are your ancestors.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.